Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, everyone. Our weekly college football primer, Rivalry Week. And really, this week, in the games that are contained in this week, most notably the game, are why people love this sport so much. It's why I love this sport so much. I'm wearing a Troy Smith jersey from 15, almost 20 years ago. I'm feeling old now. I grew up watching Ohio State, Michigan, watching the Iron Bowl, coming home after Thanksgiving and seeing Texas and A&M play. I am old enough to remember those games. Let's talk about some college football. I really do want to just talk about the game, but I would be remiss to leave out a few things. Notably, the committee has finally caught up to me. I've had Washington at the number 4 spot for weeks and weeks and weeks, and to be honest, I think I personally might even be underrating Washington a little bit at this point because if you compare their strength of schedule and their strength of record to Michigan, there's really no comparison. I don't think anybody in the top 4 has as good of a win as Washington does, and Washington has a number of wins over Utah, over Oregon State in the rain on the road as an underdog at home against Oregon, and there's only one other team in the top 10 that has a win as good as the Oregon win, and that's Texas, who I think has the best win in the country. More on Texas in a minute. So it's nice to see Washington getting its flowers, but it's kind of annoying that it took this long for them to get to that point, but we're here now. Speaking of the team whose spot they just took, Florida State. Man, Jordan Travis was having a really good season. Unfortunately, him getting injured the way he did against North Alabama last Saturday is probably it for his time at Florida State and his time in college. And it's super heartbreaking, and he was leading Florida State in a really, really good season. And I know that I personally haven't been as high on them as a team. They were still in perfect position to make the playoff. And so, super unfortunate for him. Hopefully he can bounce back and some positives can be gained out of this. And while we're on the topic of Florida State, not all is lost. Taking his spot is someone named Tate Rodemaker. I apologize for one of those two pronunciations is wrong, so I apologize for the wrong one. Florida State still has a chance to make a couple of statements. Now, Florida is a really, really bad team, and by all rights, the Seminoles should win this weekend. However, they've punched the ACC title game has been set, and they have a date with Louisville next week. The significance of that is that Louisville is actually a top 10 ranked team, both by the committee standards and by my standards. Here's my top 10, just for standard of comparison. And the ironic thing about this is that we may actually get a chance to see history repeat itself in the final year of the 4-team format. So for those of you that may remember, back in 2014, the first year of the playoff format featured 3 teams vying for that final spot. One team was an Ohio State team that lost not one but 2 Heisman candidate quarterbacks. And then they turned to a third stringer who was making his first ever collegiate start in the Big Ten title game against a top 15 ranked Wisconsin, a game they were underdogs in. Florida State is finding themselves in a similar position. They're still 11-0. So if they can get to that game undefeated, they can still make the playoff. And who knows what happens after that. I'm not saying that they're going to do what Ohio State did back then. I don't think they're nearly as talented as that Ohio State team. I'm just saying the precedent is there, and all hope is not lost. Not yet for them. That is the silver lining. Still a super unfortunate turn of events. Let's go on down the line a little bit. I think Oregon looks like a very complete team. However, their best win is now not ranked. And I think that's actually a mistake by the committee. Utah should be ranked, especially if we're going to put Tennessee in the top 25. I've been saying for weeks that Tennessee should not be in the top 20, let alone the top 25. Every time they've played a good team, they folded like a lawn chair. They did it again. They got blown out at home by Georgia. When they played Florida, they lost by double digits. Utah, a team they're ranked over, beat by double digits. They played Alabama and blew a lead in the most horrendous of ways, lost that game by double digits. Noticing a trend here. They have no business being anywhere near the top 20. I am very, very hesitant to say this committee's biased or that media company's biased, but stuff like this, it does feel like a little bit of rigging the deck a little bit for certain teams, and here's why. There's a lot of noise saying that, hypothetically, if Texas, who is still sitting at 10-1 currently, goes into the Big 12 title game and wins it at 12-1. And Alabama somehow upsets Georgia and they finish 12-1, it's just down to those two for that final spot. There are people legitimately, unironically arguing for Alabama to be voted into the top 4 over a team it lost to at home by double digits. It wouldn't be the first time Alabama's gotten that kind of benefit of the doubt, but it would highlight the absurdity of this sport in the inherent subjectivity of it. And we've seen this with Bama before, and I don't want to get too up in arms over a hypothetical that in all likelihood won't happen. But I'm saying there are people unironically arguing for it, and the more it gets spoken up, the more it gets spoken into existence. It's a weird sport, and weirder things have been known to happen. Really, the biggest difference between my top 10 and the committee's top 10 is that I have Oklahoma in the top 10 over Missouri, and I have some of the individual spots rearranged. Because Texas has easily the best win out of anybody in the country, I have them as the highest-rated one-loss team. I think they've earned it. No disrespect to Oregon and Alabama, they all still have a very real shot at making that Final Four. It's really hard to argue against Texas, especially because their opponents have the strongest collective record at this point. We're at the point where we got to start splitting hairs and being super pedantic about resumes, and this is the beginning of it. I have Oklahoma in there because they have that win over Texas, and if I'm going to have Texas that high, I then have to turn around and say, well, the team that beat Texas should be a pretty good team too, even though Oklahoma lost 2 of 3 right after the Red River game. If we're taking seasons as a complete body of work as opposed to a 3-week stretch, and now I don't think Oklahoma should be near the playoff. I don't think they're one of the best 5 or 8 teams in the country, but they do have a better argument for top 10 over a Penn State and a Missouri with similar records. And we do have Louisville hanging around. Now, there is an argument, if all hell breaks loose, that they might have a sneaky shot at the playoff. However, Louisville has been playing with fire against some really bad teams, and most notably a Virginia team that was leading for most of that game. And so the jury's out on Louisville. Very good team, very great season, and there's a very real shot that they win the ACC this year. One more time, my top 10. Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, Washington, get at me, committee. Followed by Florida State, Texas, Oregon, Alabama, Louisville, and Oklahoma bringing up the rear. Now that I've had a chance to react a little bit to the previous week's games, let's look at some of the most significant rivalry games coming this week. Lightning round, Rivalry Week edition. First one, the Civil War. Oregon State goes to Eugene and plays Oregon. Oregon is a 14-point favorite. Oregon State is coming off of a brutal loss against Washington in which they had a very, very real shot to win the game. This time they are down double digits. And to be honest, Oregon has just been completely steamrolling everybody with the exception of the Washington game. Oregon State is really the only thing standing between them and a rematch against Washington. I think Oregon wins the game. I think Bo Nix starts to put a bow, see what I did there, on his Heisman campaign. But I think I respect Oregon State a little too much to think that they're going to get blown out. I can see Oregon winning by somewhere in the 10 to 13 range. It would mildly surprise me to see Oregon State lose by more than that. So I'm going to give Oregon State the points, but Oregon the win. Next one, we go down to the swamp. Florida State plays Florida Gators. And I don't think that this is one of the best rivalry matchups this year, but I think this is really a chance to see what Florida State can do with the loss of Jordan Travis in mind, which is why the line is only 6.5 for Florida State. And going into, regardless of how good Florida is, that is an intimidating stadium to go on the road and play again, especially for someone making their first start. I just think Florida State has a much better roster, much better coaching. Florida's been boundering all year. They had a double-digit loss to Utah to start out, had a strong month after that and just kind of fell apart. I don't see Florida State losing this game, but I can see why the line is as small as it is. So I'll give Florida State a narrow win and Florida the cover. Okay, so this next one isn't explicitly a rivalry, but I'm highlighting this one for one reason. Jaden Daniels, despite the fact that LSU is out of the SEC race, out of the national title race, Jaden Daniels is still very much alive in the Heisman race. And this is his last chance to add to that resume before other teams and players will have a chance to play next weekend. Texas A&M goes to Death Valley as 11.5-point dogs. I think LSU wins. I think they cover. I think Jaden Daniels has another monster game, and we will see him in New York in a few weeks. Another fun rivalry that has had some absolute classic games, including the one last year, North Carolina goes to NC State. North Carolina are 2.5-point favorites. And North Carolina is on the list of one of the most disappointing teams this year to me. I feel like with Drake May getting the hype he has, and with Mac Brown getting his 100th win, a second school, North Carolina always feels like a team in a program that should be more than they are. They have resources and institutional support and things like that, and they just never quite seem to put it together outside of having some decent but not amazing seasons. Meanwhile, NC State has had some very memorable moments this year, including an upset over Clemson and an amazing post-game press conference right after that. This should be a great game. I'm going to go North Carolina in the points here. All of that was a preamble. You know what I'm here to talk about. I know what I'm here to talk about. Let's talk about it. The game. Oh, man. So this is one of the most loaded editions in 125-year-long rivalry. So the first thing to know is that the Michigan scandal has gotten worse. Since the last time I made a video on the subject, Michigan has fired one of its defensive coaches, someone who is a known collaborator with Connor Stallions. They decided to stop pursuing legal action about the Jim Harbaugh suspension and just accept it. And so Jim Harbaugh will not be on the sidelines for this game. Michigan is coming off of a classic trap game, near upset against Maryland, a game Maryland had a very real shot to win. For these last couple of weeks, Michigan has looked mortal. Just how mortal and how much of it is an illusion, how much of it's a trap game, let's get into it. Here are some interesting stats about this rivalry, when what I think is the best rivalry in college sports, one of the best rivalries in sports, or at least it's very much up there. Between these two programs, there are 19 claimed national titles, almost 2,000 wins, 10 Heisman winners, 83 Big Ten titles, and nearly 900 draft picks. There are 14 games, this year's included, where these two teams have met up as top 5 ranked teams, and including the third year in a row. One of the most notable ones this century comes in the 2006 edition of the game, where Ohio State and Michigan played, and this was before the Big Ten had a title game, and so the winner of that game was guaranteed a spot in the national title game. While the stakes aren't getting launched straight into the final game of the season high, I think it's reasonable to assume that a playoff berth is on the line, regardless of what happens against Iowa in the Big Ten title game. And then there's a little bit more to that. Michigan quarterback J.J. McCarthy's name has come up in Heisman discussions. Ohio State wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. has come up in Heisman discussions, and so you could see this as a proxy fight over a spot in New York as well. Neither are currently the leader in the Heisman standings. I believe currently that would be a mixed. I believe Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix are at the top as of this moment. But nevertheless, there are still 2 games left in the season for whomever wins this game, and so whomever wins this game will have a couple more chances to pad their stats. But one thing about J.J. McCarthy's stats that I found a little bit surprising when I was actually doing some diving into the numbers on this one is that they're actually not far off from what Ohio State quarterback Kyle McCord has been doing this year as well. So listen to this. J.J. McCarthy has one of the highest completion percentages in college at 73.8% at 9.9 yards per completion on average. He has 18 touchdowns to 4 interceptions, 2,335 passing yards, and has a couple of rushing touchdowns on top of that. Kyle McCord is a little bit lower with the completion percentage at 66.4%, but has almost 600 more yards at 2,899. 22 touchdowns to 4 interceptions at 9.1 yards per completion. I think Ohio State fans, especially this year, have had a little bit of an adjustment period as far as McCord is concerned, simply because he's not the type of quarterback that we've seen out of that program in a while. And he's behind an offensive line that is not as stout as we're seeing, with nearly 18 sacks given up for Ohio State this year. The sacks are going to be one of the bigger concern points if Michigan can consistently pressure him outside. We'll see. Now, part of that is that coming into the year, Ohio State had to rebuild its offensive line, but we're 3 months into the season. We're at the very end. They are what they are at this point. That's not to say they're horrible, but they had a rushing offense that was ranked in the 90s for the better part of the season. It's currently a little bit higher than that. It's currently in the mid-80s. Part of that is for the second year in a row, they've had a succession of injuries at the running back position. Running back Mayan Williams was lost for the year. Breakout star running back Trevion Henderson has been missing time on and off pretty much all year. Chip Trainum's been dealing with injury issues. Part of it is that they just haven't been able to establish any sort of consistency in the run game, backed by an offensive line that is frankly just kind of underperformed all year. When you add it to a running back room that has been nowhere near healthy at all. Now, TreVeyon Henderson, for the last month of the season or so, has been a lot more healthy and a lot more dangerous, and Ohio State's going to need him, especially on the road in the Big House. Middle of the pack, and that's kind of being slightly generous, as Ohio State's run game has been, their passing offense is actually a top 25 rated. It's only 23rd as of right now, but Marvin Harrison Jr., as I just said, is a Heisman contender. He has almost 1,100 yards catching with an average of 17.6 yards per catch at 13 touchdowns and has a rushing touchdown on top of that. You can scheme for this guy as much as you want. It's almost like going up against in NBA, it's almost like going up against LeBron James or Steph Curry or somebody. You know they're still going to get their points. You just got to roll with it. Like the classic formula to beat LeBron was, for a long time, was let him get his and then make the other people on the team do more work, basically. We've been seeing a lot of doubling and like bracketing of Marvin Harrison, and that's partially why TreVeyon Henderson has been able to break out a little bit more. But even then, the guy is still putting up good numbers. That's one of the factors that we should see, and really the only game this year where it seems like he's been a non-factor was actually the Notre Dame game. Another game on the road against a tough opponent. Remember Blake Corum, how he was in the Heisman conversation for a long time last year? He's still hanging around. He has almost 900 rushing yards and an average of 4.9 yards per rush, and he has 20 rushing touchdowns. The guy's a very good, very productive back. One of the concerning things for Michigan's offense is that they've actually had some injuries on the offensive line, and because of that, they've had to shift starters over to positions where they are not like their natural starting position, and that was something that both Penn State and Maryland recently have been able to take advantage of, and that is something I that's one of the things I expect to actually turn the game for Ohio State, is because guys like JTT on the Ohio State defensive line, and while Ohio State's defensive line isn't like world beaters in terms of pass rush, they've generated 5 less sacks than Michigan. They've given up one play all season of 40 or more yards, and that play was on a fumble-rooski. Really what we're seeing here is 2 of the top 3 defenses in all of college football coming together. And so it wouldn't shock me if this game mirrors both teams' respective games against Penn State. It wouldn't shock me if it mirrored that. It wouldn't shock me if it mirrored Ohio State's victory at Notre Dame. One of the concerning things for Michigan is that when Penn State's defense kept them in the game for a long time, they had to go completely away from their Heisman contending quarterback and just finished that game off with 32 straight runs. Now, you can look at that one of 2 ways. One is you can say, well, they just did what they had to do to win. Good teams find ways to win. And yes, I think there is something to that. Washington is proof of that. That also signifies a sense that maybe the quarterback that you're propping up can't be trusted as much as you would like him to be, if that's really going to be an issue. Now, I don't think Michigan's going to run the ball 30 straight times, especially at home. I don't think they'll need to, or at least in an ideal world for them, I'd imagine they don't want to have to do that again. But the one thing I would be surprised to see would be an offensive shootout, which is why you never know what to expect from this game, which is why if it has a 50-50 shot of happening. Another defensive stat that favors Michigan is actually turnover margin. They're one of the top teams in the country in terms of turnover margin with plus 13, whereas Ohio State is very middle of the road with only plus 1. They've lost roughly equivalent amounts of turnovers, just Ohio State's defense hasn't generated as many as they normally would. They've lost a few more turnovers than Michigan too, and so that is a factor to watch out for, is turnovers, and whoever can get more pressure on offensive lines that, frankly, from both programs could be better. These defenses are rated pretty dead even. Ohio State is 3rd in total D, Michigan's 1st in total D. One gives up 3.99 yards per play, the other gives up 4.21 yards per play. They've both given up less than 20 touchdowns, and I think both have given up less than 15 offensive touchdowns all year. I kind of expect that these 2 teams' defenses will dictate the pace of the game, as I've already said, and so it just comes down to who can make one more play. Who can be that guy? Last year, we saw J.J. McCarthy do something he hadn't done all year and start throwing the ball downfield with a great amount of success. Weirdly enough, I do trust Ohio State a little bit more in this situation, even though Michigan has a super senior heavy roster and a super experienced roster, because they've been in this position all year. They've had to, even their Big Ten West draws that they've had to play have been tougher than what Michigan had to do. They had to grind it out against, admittedly, a mediocre Wisconsin team, but Camp Randall at night. They had to go to Notre Dame with a minute left. They were faced with a 3rd and 19, a 4th and 7 on the goal line with 1 second left and only one play to get it right. They've seen that adversity this year, and honestly, I think that Notre Dame game, even though Notre Dame's season kind of didn't pan out the way that I'm sure the Irish would have hoped, is still one of the best wins that program has had in a couple of years. And I think experience you get from a game like that can help put you over the top in a game like this. So, and then the last factor for this is who really knows where Michigan's heads are going to be at with everything going around the program. I've had 2 people involved with the program fired, another's been suspended, and then you had a coach before the season get fired. There's FBI investigations. There's a lot of noise, and it's very easy to lose focus in a situation like that. There's a huge mental factor to this. So where is Michigan's heads going to be at, especially at home? Is Ohio State going to be so out for blood that they just play recklessly and cost them the game? Happened last year. Or is Michigan's head's not going to be in it? I'd be a little surprised if the latter were the case. But you do have to wonder how this situation, especially with how protracted it's been almost a month and a half of just straight scandal news coming out of Ann Arbor. What is the status of that team right now? With all that being said, I'm going to roll with the Ohio State Buckeyes to come in as 3-point underdogs and win the Big Ten East, beat Michigan, and go to Indianapolis next week for the Big Ten title game. Ohio State wins. OH. Like I said, that's all I have for you guys this week. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you guys are having a wonderful and safe holiday season. I hope you guys enjoyed Rivalry Week, and I will see you next week for Conference Championship Week here on Empire Media. That's AMPIRE, and you can find us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.